pretty much all of the major monetary authorities have reduced interest rates very nearly as much as is possible. That's most obvious in the case of the United States, where we look at short-term interest rates, which are the interest rates that are more or less under the direct control of the Federal Reserve, and short-term interest rates have been reduced effectively to zero. Small fraction of 1%, occasionally really actually zero. They cannot be reduced any further. This is something that happened only once before in the history of the United States. It happened in the 1930s during the depths of the Great Depression. Now it has happened again. And what this means is that there is no further room for monetary easing, at least conventional monetary policy. There is nothing more that the Federal Reserve can do to push the economy forward. The European Central Bank, which is the world's other most important central bank, has a little bit more room, but not much. Effectively, we've reached the limits of conventional monetary policy. For some people, this has come as a total shock. Not for me, not for a number of other economists. In the 1990s, a number of us were very disturbed by the problems of Japan. Some people looked at the problems of Japan and said, this just shows that the Japanese are bad businessmen, or that the Japanese have bad policy. But for some of us, we looked at Japan's troubles in the 1990s and said, this is ominous, because Japan is a country that has all the advantages. It's an advanced economy, has a stable government. It has the ability to formulate policy. It has reasonably intelligent policy makers. And if this could happen to Japan, perhaps it could happen to Europe, perhaps it could happen to the United States. And sure enough, it did happen. The book that I think some of you have, The Return of Depression Economics, I wrote an original version of it in 1998 in response to the problems of Japan and the problems of the crisis in Southeast Asia, worrying that such problems could crop up in larger parts of the world, that they could happen in the United States. The version you have now is a new edition, written in the light of the fact that those concerns have proved correct, that we've had the same problem in the advanced world as a whole, with crises similar to those of developing Asia now occurring in other parts of the world, such as emerging Europe. As I said, a number of people were concerned about it. If I was writing, worrying about a Japan-type experience, so were other people, including one of the major scholars, both of the 1930s, that period, and of the problems of Japan and the possible response to a Japanese type of situation, was none other than the chairman of the Princeton Economics Department, now demoted to running the world, Ben Bernanke. So he wrote quite a lot about this, and to some extent this is the crisis that he was prepared for, the crisis that he had thought a lot about how to confront. But the unpleasant revelation has been that the crisis is so severe that doing the things that he and others at the Federal Reserve had thought of, in effect executing the contingency plans, was not enough to produce a recovery. Enough perhaps to diminish the crisis, but not enough to produce recovery. And my great concern now is not Great Depression II, but something like the experience of Japan, this time not in one country, but in the world economy as a whole. So if we're looking for the thing to be worried about, it would be something like this. This is per capita real GDP in Japan. Japan, as you see, was a high-growth economy. Of course, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and continuing into the 1980s, remained an economy with a high rate of growth. Then it had a financial crisis, falling land prices, falling stocks at the beginning of the 1990s. There was never a really severe recession. It's interesting that in comparing the current crisis with Japan in the 90s, we have actually started out much worse. As some of my friends say, these days, Japan's lost decade is actually looking pretty good compared with what we're going through. But the Japanese economy, while it did not experience a really severe downturn, also did not have any real recovery for a very extended period. Japan essentially, as the line says, it experienced a decade, really about 12 years of stagnation in its economic growth. It finally broke out of that stagnation starting about 2003, largely thanks to a rapid increase in exports, a large trade surplus, which is in itself a little bit disturbing. Let me describe where I think we are right now in the world economy. Like Japan, we've suffered the deflation of a major bubble. This time a bubble in housing in the United States, but also housing in a number of European countries. Also a bubble in capital flows. Much of European growth was being driven by very large flows of capital to the emerging markets of Eastern Europe. Those flows have collapsed as people realized that they were not sustainable. So we have a large imploded bubble, very much like Japan in the 1990s. We have the exhaustion of conventional monetary policy. Interest rates are zero at the short end. No further room for monetary expansion. We have the use of fiscal policy, expansionary spending policies in a number of countries, especially the United States and China. All of these policies enough to help, but not enough to produce full recovery. So as, for example, to look at the United States, the Obama plan is expected to create about 3.5 million jobs, which is a reasonable estimate. 3.5 million sounds about right, although because this is economics, you probably want to say plus or minus 2 million. But still, 3.5 million jobs is the best estimate, which sounds good until you realize that the United States has lost 5.7 million jobs already in this recession and needed to create about 1.8 million jobs over the recession just to keep up with a growing population. So we are, in fact, already 7.5 million jobs down, and yet we have a stimulus plan which will only create about 3.5 million, and it will probably get worse. It's a plan that helps but does not produce recovery. You might say, well, how about bigger plans? Well, there may be more from the United States. But around the world, many countries are very cautious because they're worried about the burden of debt. And so we are not actually managing to have fiscal expansion that is large enough to really produce a full recovery. Around the world, we have central banks that are engaged in expansionary policy. They can't cut interest rates anymore, but they can buy unconventional assets. They can buy private sector debt. They can buy long-term government debt. And the Federal Reserve has tripled the size of its balance sheet doing this, which helps. But most estimates suggest that if it could cut interest rates, it would cut them by at least 5 percentage points. Since it can't, it has to do a lot, and what it's doing is not enough. What it has done in terms of these other policies is perhaps the equivalent of another 1 percentage point off the interest rate. Not enough to produce recovery again. What this suggests is that the world may well be facing something that looks like Japan's lost decade. I hope that it does not go on for a decade. If we are wise and fortunate, we may be able to produce a full recovery sooner than that. But it is probably going to be a very extended period of economic weakness. Sometimes we talk in terms of the alphabet. We're very unlikely to have a V-shaped recovery, where the economy goes down but then goes sharply back up again. We are very likely to have a U-shaped recovery, where the economy goes down and then it takes a long time before it comes back up again. And there's a real possibility that we'll have an L-shaped recovery, or more accurately, lack of recovery.